One early morning in 1268, in some corner of the English countryside, a peasant called William found something that would one day completely alter his destiny. A faint, abnormal colored patch had appeared on his forearm, painless, unnoteworthy at first sight, but ominously resistant. It was a subtle introduction to a fearful decline. That tiny mark was the first indication of a disease that would rob him of his health, identity, and dignity. Leprosy. Once an honored part of his community, William was soon discarded, his body slowly breaking down as his neighbors shrank from him in terror. He wasn't merely sick, he had become invisible. Leprosy, now called Hansen's disease, has plagued humanity for more than 4,000 years. It is not only a disease, but an historic icon of fear and rejection. Throughout ancient texts, medieval accounts, and even contemporary memory, there have been few maladies that have instilled such profound, lasting terror. In 2009, archaeologists excavated a 4,000-year-old skeleton in India, exhibiting telltale symptoms of leprosy, spookily identical to those discovered in medieval graves throughout Europe. Brought on by the bacterium Mycobacterium leprae, this ancient disease doesn't strike without warning. It lies dormant within the body for decades, sometimes as long as 20 years, before divulging its ruinous consequences: nerve degeneration, loss of sensation, and, in advanced cases, the ghastly deformations that have fed horror tales and stigma for centuries. As opposed to plagues that are quick killers, leprosy compels its victims to endure a slow disintegration of the body, the soul, and the social connections that encase an individual within society. It removes not just physical well-being, but also human connection. But perhaps worst of all is the solitude. Throughout the ages, a mere suspicion of leprosy was sufficient to exile a person from society. Ignorance, superstition, and self-interest turned the diseased into pariahs, relegated to live on the periphery, alive but erased. To this day, with all our advanced knowledge in medicine, approximately 200,000 new cases of leprosy continue to be reported annually worldwide. So how did it happen that one tiny bacterium came to represent both divine retribution and social death? To get an appreciation of the sheer ugliness of this disease, we have to go back in time, through ancient cemeteries, through religious and medical texts, to the roots of leprosy itself. What we find is a story not only of misery, but how fear itself can be an illness. Let's start. Leprosy has its roots in ancient history, possibly originating in the Indian subcontinent or East Africa, before spreading via human migration. Leprosy had already been established in ancient societies by 2000 BCE. Indian scriptures, like the Vedas of around 1400 BCE, refer to a disease by the name of Kushta, which was a range of skin afflictions, including what we now know as leprosy. These early reports spoke of scaly, colored skin, usually associated with social ostracism and religious uncleanliness. The earliest clinical account similar to contemporary leprosy was provided by the Greek physician Aretaeus of Cappadocia in 150 AD. He documented an illness referred to as elephantiasis, so named for the thickened, coarse skin it produced. His careful observations followed its gradual development from discoloration spots to wholesale body disfiguration and nerve injury. The Greeks, aware of its distinctly severe impact, called it elephantiasis Graecorum. As empires grew, the disease spread with them. The Roman Empire, with its extensive military and trade corridors, was a conduit for its transmission. Alexander the Great's soldiers are supposed to have been introduced to leprosy during their wars in India in the 4th century BCE and brought it back to the Mediterranean. Even Emperor Constantine the Great, who had founded Constantinople, is said to have suffered from it, according to religious tradition and medieval iconography. By the early medieval era, leprosy was epidemic in Europe. It arrived in England by the 4th century and was a routine aspect of life by 1050 A.D. By 1200 CE, there were over 19,000 hospitals for leprosy in Europe. In a few areas, 1 in every 30 individuals might have been infected. And yet, the illness was still terribly misunderstood. In medieval Europe, the absence of scientific knowledge led to outlandish theories. Men and women thought leprosy was caused by immoral acts, the consumption of spoiled fish, or even sex during menstruation. Others alleged it was God's punishment, or just a case of bad blood. The ignorance fueled a maelstrom of superstition and fear. The pain did not stop at the body. Victims were given horrifying diagnoses, social ostracism, and religious condemnation. Let's get closer to the disease itself. Leprosy starts insidiously. Faint, barely perceptible changes in skin color termed macules, which gradually lose sensitivity. When Mycobacterium leprae grows, it invades the peripheral nerves, producing numb, susceptible areas. Far from the popular myth, fingers and toes don't drop off. Rather, multiple injuries, unnoticed because of numbness, become infections and tissue destruction so profound that fingers and toes eventually atrophy. At times, the destruction is so massive that muscles atrophy, bones deteriorate, and are slowly reabsorbed by the body. It's not only a disease of bodily deterioration, it's a disease of disappearance, of body, of community, of hope. The vicious hold of leprosy does not tighten in one night. It seizes years, often decades, of gradual, unyielding devastation. Victims are compelled to watch helplessly as their own bodies turn against them bit by bit. As the disease progresses, it starts attacking the face. Perhaps the most terrifying characteristic of medieval leprosy was its attack on facial nerves. Cartilage is worn away over time, the nose dissolves, and the face takes on a grotesque, flattened look, producing what came to be known as the leonine face. In a culture where appearance was linked to identity and status, this deformation did not merely blemish the body. It obliterated the individual. Eyes were not immune either. The bacteria tended to infect the cornea and adjacent tissue, resulting in partial or complete blindness. Nerve pain transformed each day into a struggle against the body itself. And yet, amidst it all, mental acuity persisted. Victims lived through a waking nightmare, full awareness, full consciousness, as their bodies disintegrated around them. More torturous still was the pain paradox. The disease anesthetized areas of the body, taking away the sense of injury or heat. But at the same time, it could also bring excruciating pain in the nerves in other areas, as if taunting its victims with moments of silence and agony. Picture yourself with the constant dread of unperceived wounds when your nerves were shrieking from non-existent injuries. That was the cruel twinned duality of leprosy. Historical accounts reflect both the physical and social contexts of life with the disease. In 1420, a case in Lincolnshire, England, testifies to the desperation of society to impose separation. John L.A., a Boston mercer, was admonished by local authorities for not keeping himself apart. He was accused of commonly mingle among townspeople and refused to remove himself, putting others in so-called danger. His case speaks to a universal tension between society's anxiety over contamination and the individual's refusal to be eliminated. Centuries afterward, in 19th century New Brunswick, Canada, fear became mythic. The tale of Ursule Benoit, an Acadian leprosy victim who died, was local legend. During her funeral, it was reported that the liquefied corpse oozed onto a pallbearer's shoulder, whereupon he contracted leprosy and perished. Whether or not this is true or folklore, it illustrates the persistent fear surrounding even dead leprosy victims' bodies. The resulting epidemic resulted in draconian remedies. In 1844, the New Brunswick Commission had found 18 survivors of the disease, and they were quarantined on Sheldrake Island, a remote old cholera station, some as young as 8. They were taken from the world, families, and prospects. Dr. Robert Bayard, in an article in The Lancet, lamented their fate. The crimeless sufferer has been condemned by the legislature of his country to perpetual imprisonment. But not every tale is of cruelty and banishment. Some suggest compassion, even dignity. In Winchester, England, archaeologists found the skeleton of a young man, SK-27, entombed in the graveyard of St. Mary Magdalene Hospital, a reputed leprosy hospital. DNA and isotopic testing confirmed he had traveled from as far away as southern Europe or North Africa, perhaps on pilgrimage. And even though he was clearly ill, he wasn't buried separately or in shame. He was placed with others, indicating care, acceptance, and religious respect. Half a world away, on a distant Kalaupapa Peninsula in Hawaii, thousands of leprosy patients were forcibly exiled by the U.S. government. This natural penal colony, hemmed in by sea cliffs, was a place of endurance, solidarity, and quiet defiance. Among them was Father Damien, a Belgian missionary priest who gave his life among the afflicted. He himself fell ill with the disease and wrote in his letters of fighting to preserve dignity and belief in the context of social death. Medieval society's reaction to leprosy was not purely cruel. It was multifaceted, influenced by religion as much as by fear. Others viewed leprosy as God's punishment for sin. Lepers, however, were thought by others to be closer to God and going through their own purgatory here on earth and being guaranteed immediate entrance into heaven. It followed a peculiar paradox. Lepers were revered spiritually and feared. Giving to leper hospitals or nursing lepers was an act that may shorten one's own stay in purgatory. Between the 11th century and 1350, there were a minimum of 320 leper hospitals and religious houses founded in England alone. These tended to be sited at the periphery of towns or along main roads, not completely separated, but not completely integrated either. Lepers were still in need of society. Therefore, they begged, traded, and prayed for donors' souls. Within those places, life was intensely religious. Patients resided in small cottages around chapels where prayer and hymns filled the air all day. Hygiene, nutrition, and emotional attention were their priorities. Patients' clothing was cleaned daily, food was cultivated in shared gardens, and scented herbs were grown to bring healing and comfort as well as health. They were not hospitals, but efforts to save humanity in the midst of breakdown. But beyond their gates, the stigma remained. Lepers were frequently compelled to dress differently, or use bells or clappers to alert others of their approach. They were excluded from inns, churches, mills, bakehouses, and public streams, prohibited from touching healthy individuals or treading narrow roads, they existed in a state of limbo, present yet invisible, alive yet socially dead. Even in some of the colonies, lepers employed distinct currency, a chilling indicator of how deep fear of contamination had penetrated. Even coins, inanimate and lifeless objects, were believed to be carriers of disease. Architecture is also a testament to this fear. Some medieval churches constructed leper squints, tiny openings in walls, so the diseased could see Mass without entering. These plain slits are mute reminders of a world that promised spiritual promise, but kept its distance. By the 14th century, leprosy was no longer just a feared disease. It was a social and moral verdict. And then came the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1350, the plague ravaged Europe, killing millions. In the wake of the disaster, public sentiment hardened towards disease. The sight of mass death made the public more afraid of contagion than ever before, and leprosy patients were the unfortunate victims. The rules were more strictly enforced. Isolation became greater, and abuse and corruption ran rampant under the banner of public health. Ironically, at the very moment when society's treatment of lepers became more harsh, the disease itself started to recede. Around the 1400s, cases of leprosy started to decline. By the 1600s, it had nearly disappeared from most European countries. Why? No one knows for certain. Other researchers are convinced that advances in living standards, improved diets, pure water, and sanitation strengthened people's immune systems. Others look at tuberculosis, which started spreading around the same period. Because TB and leprosy bacteria are genetically close, immunity to one might have conferred resistance to the other. Decades of misunderstanding and fear continued until 1873, when the Norwegian doctor G. H. Armauer Hansen discovered the perpetrator, Mycobacterium leprae, the microbe that causes leprosy. The first human disease ever attributed to a known microbe, it was to transform the practice of medicine and shatter centuries of theological and moral outrage. But for the dead, the exiled, the maimed millions, Hansen's findings came too late. Nevertheless, it set the stage for cure. In 1941, Dr. Guy Henry Faget cured leprosy patients at the National Leprosarium in Carville, Louisiana, using the drug Promin. Leprosy was curable for the first time in history. Then, in 1981, the World Health Organization launched multi-drug therapy, providing free medication to patients worldwide. Antibiotics sealed leprosy's reign of terror forever. But whereas science overcame the bacteria, the stigma endured. Today, Hansen's disease patients continue to experience discrimination, isolation, and fear, particularly in areas where the disease is still not well understood. Groups such as the Leprosy Mission are working to reverse this. Their aim: increase awareness, dispel myths, and end transmission by 2035. The battle against leprosy has changed from a medical fight to a social fight. Its legacy surrounds us, in language, in law, in architecture, in how we treat illness and difference. Words such as moral leper or don't treat me like I have leprosy reverberate with the old linkage of disease and dishonor. The word leper became a human metaphor for shame, for marginalization, for rejection. But the harm did not end in metaphor. The fear and exclusion that leprosy brought influenced how societies treated illness and disability of all sorts. Indeed, leper hospitals, or leprosaria, were the template for contemporary institutions. They established notions of medical isolation, charitable care, and special housing for the chronically ill. These foundations went on to impact hospitals, nursing homes, and public health protocols. And the reverberations of leprosy's history didn't stop in the Middle Ages. When the AIDS epidemic broke in the 1980s and 90s, the same trends came back. Quarantine proposals, moral condemnation, and social ostracism. The template created in leprosy's most terrible moments was heartbreakingly reused. Even during the 20th century, leprosy victims were still being segregated. In 1917, the U.S. government acquired the Carville Leprosarium and renamed it the Gillis W. Long Hansen's Disease Center. In Japan, state-run colonies persisted in the 2000s. In 2001, a judicial investigation concluded that Japanese patients had been unlawfully segregated, deprived of rights, and abandoned not only by state and physicians, but also by courts and media. Leprosy's long shadow continues to cast itself over contemporary medicine. The renaming of the disease, from leprosy to Hansen's disease, isn't merely medical. It's symbolic, an intentional attempt to erase the centuries of shame attached to the former name. The World Health Organization has gone so far as to suggest removing leprosy from medical terminology entirely. Because words have power, and in this instance, they have trauma. Contemporary science has unveiled one last harsh irony. Approximately 95% of all individuals are naturally resistant to Hansen's disease. That is, the overwhelming majority of human beings could never have gotten it even with heavy exposure. All the terror, all the banishment, all the pain, unnecessary. Science unveiled an astonishing fact. Some individuals have a gene that renders them naturally immune to leprosy, and this gene is especially prevalent in Europeans. This finding could account for the disappearance of leprosy from Europe centuries prior to the invention of modern treatments. The disease did not disappear because it mutated. It vanished because humans did. Genetic analysis of medieval remains indicates that the ancient Mycobacterium leprae DNA is almost identical to the modern circulating strain. The 2F strain lineage, which was present in medieval Europe, persists in South Central and Western Asia in the present day. This genetic stability demonstrates one thing. It wasn't the disease that adapted. It was we, and which means a great deal of the agony, the loneliness, the terror, the rejection, was not only cruel, but avoidable. Every year, approximately 225 individuals in the U.S. and 250,000 individuals globally are diagnosed with Hansen's disease. It can infect nerves, skin, eyes, and nasal passages. But with antibiotics today, it is completely treatable. Early treatment and diagnosis avoid the once fearsome permanent damage that haunted entire civilizations. Indeed, in 2000, the World Health Organization officially announced leprosy eradicated as a public health issue, referred to as fewer than one case per 10,000 individuals. This is one of the triumphs of modern medicine over ancient fear. And yet, there is still stigma in some parts of the world. The disease is still feared more than it is known. And because of that fear, they avoid being treated, building a cycle of unnecessary pain. The fight against leprosy is no longer a medical crisis. It's a fight for awareness, for reality, for human dignity. Many of the misconceptions about leprosy, that it was a sign of sin or that it spread easily, were crafted and spread by Victorian-era medical historians with segregationist agendas. Modern research has dismantled these myths, revealing them as tools of control and prejudice, not science. So, when individuals today refer to leprosy as an ancient disease, they are only half correct. It is ancient and modern, a sickness of the past that persists not in the mysterious past, but in the very contemporary present. Approximately 200,000 individuals are diagnosed with Hansen's disease annually. And although medicine has changed it from a death sentence to a curable illness, the social and psychological scars have not healed as rapidly. And here's where the greatest tragedy of all is: what used to take centuries of suffering, dread, and isolation can now be cured within 6 to 12 months. A quick course of antibiotic therapy, gratis across the globe since 1981, will cure the disease, and yet 4 millennia of prejudice have left some individuals too humiliated to seek treatment. The leprosy lesson is larger than germs and drugs. It's about who we are. This illness has reflected humanity's dual nature: cruelty and kindness, ignorance and illumination. During the Middle Ages, fear of contagion existed alongside systems of care, charity, and respect for those afflicted. That contradiction lingers among us today. The medieval leper's image, hobbling the highways with bell and clapper, warning others to keep at bay, has become a permanent icon. An icon of how we handle the sick. And it poses a question that resonates across the centuries. Who are we when faced with pain? For in the end, leprosy itself did not biologically change. Human comprehension and human compassion have the potential to alter. As we end this painful and long chapter, we should bear in mind the tragedy of leprosy was never the disease. It was fear, shame,